Thank you for joining us, everyone, again, and welcome to the Mississippi River Network's webinar and panel discussion on the 30 by 30 conservation goal. My name is Maisa Khan. I am the Policy Director for the Mississippi River Network. I'm based out of St. Louis, Missouri, where it is beautiful and sunny today, and I'm thrilled to be the moderator for today's discussion. So for new friends who are joining us or watching our recording who might be unfamiliar with MRN, we are a coalition of nearly 60 nonprofit organizations and businesses working together to protect the land, water, wildlife, and people of our greatest river, the Mississippi. The network implements a national public program for the river called One Mississippi that is designed to educate, engage, and inspire people to take action to protect our river. Since 2009, the One Mississippi program has recruited 20,000 river citizens and inspired thousands of actions. If you are not already part of that river community, please visit our One Mississippi website and become a river citizen today. MRN's work is made possible by funding from the McKnight and Walton Family Foundation, so we're grateful that their support makes webinars like this possible. I'm thrilled to be joined today by 5 awesome panelists, but before I introduce each of them, I have 5 housekeeping items. So first, as you will see, we are on Zoom in the normal Zoom meeting function. So please keep yourself muted. 2, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into our chat box at any time. We'll take questions from the audience at the end of our conversation, but feel free to type that question in at any time. Third, as I said at the outset, as folks were joining us, we are currently recording this webinar, and that recording will be posted on the One Mississippi YouTube channel. If you have your video on, you may appear in that recording as a small square. So if you would prefer not to be seen in that way, please turn off your video, or if you'd like to just catch the recording on YouTube, do what you would prefer. Fourth, to make this event and the recording more accessible, we have turned on closed captioning and auto transcription. So if you would rather not see the subtitles at the bottom of your screen, if you're seeing them now, you should have a CC icon in your Zoom screen somewhere that you can right-click and hide the subtitles. And lastly, this webinar will run for 1 hour with that moderated discussion with our panelists, followed by a Q&A from our audience. So with that, I am delighted to briefly introduce our 5 panelists. I'll start off with the NCEL, National Caucus of Environmental Legislators team. We have Kate Burgess, Conservation Coordinator at NCEL. Kate enjoys collaborating with legislators on a variety of land, water, wildlife, and human issues. Kate's approach to conservation is rooted in principles of equity, justice, and community collaboration. Kate is based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. Thanks for being here, Kate. And we have Alayna Chuney on the NCEL team here with us as well. Alayna is the Mississippi River Coordinator. She is an environmental attorney who has spent most of her career focusing on clean air, clean water, and environmental injustices. Alayna is an active member of our MRN Policy Committee, thank you, and is based out of DC. Welcome to Alayna. And then I'll move on to our team from the Illinois Environmental Council. We have Eliot Clay, the Agriculture and Water Programs Director. Elliot has served in this role since December 2018 and provides support and guidance for IEC's sustainable agriculture priorities and legislative agenda. Elliot is dedicated to ensuring that agriculture, Illinois' largest source of revenue, is not depleting natural resources or negatively impacting our environment. Thanks for being here, Elliot. And we have Lindsay from Team Illinois here with us as well. Lindsay is the Conservation Director at IEC. Lindsay has been in this position since 2017 and is the lead staff on IEC's conservation, open space, and river work. In addition, she supports IEC's sustainable agriculture and local food programming. Welcome to Lindsay. And finally, we are joined by Andrew Schmidt, Senior Government Relations Representative with the Conservation Fund. Andrew represents the Conservation Fund to the administration, Congress, and non-governmental organizations regarding federal conservation policy and funding priorities. Andrew is the primary liaison with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, as well as the fund's lead on Farm Bill policy issues and works closely with congressional offices representing Midwestern states. So welcome and thank you to our 5 panelists for being here today. Full bios for each of them were included in that invitation to the webinar, so please check that out for more info. But with that, I would love to start by grounding our conversation today by learning more about each of the 3 organizations who are with us. After we've heard from each of the 3 organizations about their work, we will dig into the 30 by 30 specific conversations. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And where is my stop share? Stop sharing my screen and invite the NCEL team, Kate and Alayna, to please tell us about NCEL. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so we have a presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I do it right.
See your screen. We're not seeing the PowerPoint just yet.
Oh, we see the pizza machine.
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
Perfect. Yep.
Righty. Okay, Kate.
Okay. If you want to click present at the top next to the Perry said,
yeah, there we go.
Hungry. Me too, Perry. We were talking about pizza toppings before, and I'm sad to say that some of us on this call like pineapple on their pizza, but that's another topic. But Alayna and I are coming from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Next slide, please, Alayna. So who is NCEL? We empower a nonpartisan network of over 1,200 environmentally minded legislators. It was initially created by and for state legislators to be a space and to be kind of a facilitation network where we can help empower legislative champions to protect, conserve, and improve the natural and human environment. We love to play a connecting role across the country for state legislators. So if there are some wetlands policies in Washington and a legislator in Florida wants to do something similar, one of our services is to connect to the 2 of them, provide model language to see that there is some sort of consistency across the country, and just to help kind of reduce some of the work that is involved in being a state legislator. We like to refer to ourselves as the remote environmental staff for state legislators. And so often that looks like legislators coming to us with a question that we can research or help connecting them to other states who are doing similar work. And we just do what we're asked. We love to support legislators in any way we can. And I guess I'll really stress something that I love about this organization is that we work with legislators from all parties. We're nonpartisan. So that's kind of one of the largest value adds to us is that we can work with anyone. Right. And then I'll close and pass it on to Alayna by just saying that our work is framed in principles of anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion, both internally as an organization in the work that we're doing on an individual and personal level, and also some of our legislator-facing work. We are really committed to making sure that legislators are supported in their work towards environmentally just legislation. And with that, I will pass it to Alayna to talk about MRLC.
So I partner very closely with MRN, and we do a lot of work together. I work for NCEL, but I am like a part of the Mississippi River Legislative Caucus. And NCEL created the Mississippi River Legislative Caucus to build the capacity of state legislators to more effectively address nutrient pollution, flood resilience, outdoor recreation and access, soil health, sustainable agriculture, and environmental justice within the Mississippi River states. We realize that this is a big task, and which is why I am the Mississippi River coordinator. So I work specifically on Mississippi River related issues as it pertains to the Mississippi River states. And what's interesting about NCEL is that we have 3 primary issue areas. So we have the climate and energy, conservation, and then the environmental health and environmental justice. And, you know, while they all seem very separate, what we're realizing is that everything that we do is intertwined. So we're always partnering with each other within our programs. So Kate, for example, is from the conservation portion of our primary issue areas, and I am from the environmental health portion of our issue areas. So yeah, we're excited today to talk a little bit about 30 by 30. And Maisa, I don't know if you want us to go into our 30 by 30 slides, or you just want us to wait.
Hold that.
Okay.
Hold that. I'm going to turn it over to the Conservation Fund now. Andrew, please, if you wanted to just share a little bit about what CF does.
Sure. Thank you, Maisa. So my name is Andrew Schmidt. I am a senior government relations representative with the Conservation Fund. And for those who are not familiar with us, TCF is a national nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to conserving America's land and water legacy for future generations. So we were established in 1985, and we work with landowners, federal, state, and local agencies, and a host of other partners to conserve our nation's most important lands for people, wildlife, and communities. To date, just to give you an idea of scale, we have helped our partners conserve over 8 million acres. This includes 1.2 million acres of agricultural lands, with over 700 projects on farmland, forest land, and ranch land projects. I specifically, as Maisa mentioned, work on USDA NRCS programs that are authorized and funded through the Farm Bill. And we've worked with these programs to conserve over 100,000 acres through those programs specifically, but we work with a wide range of federal and state partners and programs, including those funded by the Land and Water Conservation Fund and other land and easement acquisition programs. We're also active in issues related to equity and justice. 2 programs I actually wanted to highlight here, our Working Farms Fund, which uses a unique and innovative model that we refer to as buy, protect, sell when it comes to easements to purchase land, and then we lease it to beginning farmers and ranchers, historically underserved, socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. We're specifically piloting this in the Atlanta region, or in Georgia around Atlanta, to lease land to beginning farmers and ranchers, and then connect them to ag land easements through NRCS programs, to then sell it to them at a reduced price, since now it has been eased through that program. We also have a program called Resourceful Communities, which provides economic assistance to some of our most economically and socially distressed communities, where some of America's most important natural areas and lands are. So this has been a lot of it through things like microloans and other small partnerships and programs that we work with a number of grantees and grantors around the country. So I will leave it there. I don't have a PowerPoint because I usually just get distracted by all the words I put up and wrote myself. So I will leave it there, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Andrew. And then I'll turn it to my Illinois Environmental Council team to tell us about IEC, please.
Yeah, so thank you all for having us. We're excited to talk about 30 by 30 and everything. IEC, the Illinois Environmental Council, largely functions as the trade organization for all of the other environmental groups in the state of Illinois. And our real purpose is to, go to the state legislature and lobby for policy that, helps support environmental health across the state from a lot of different angles. I work on a lot of agricultural issues. Lindsay works on lots of open space stuff, but we also do a lot of work on the clean energy sector. Environmental justice is a really, really big part of our work. And Chicago specifically has its own, myriad of, issues that we try to tackle at the state level or at the local level as well. So yeah, we're really just trying to, push legislators to make policy that, helps benefit everybody in Illinois. And I'm a lobbyist for those guys. So I'm actually based here in Springfield, the state capital. So whenever we're at a pre or post COVID world, I would have been suited up over the Capitol, going to committees and all that kind of fun stuff. But right now, currently broadcasting from my bedroom in Springfield. So good to be with everybody. Lindsay, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. Like Elliot said, we were created to be the lobbyists for the environment. So IEC was established when there was a need from smaller environmental organizations that were doing the work, that were boots on the ground, doing the work. They saw the large scale change that policy could have on their work, but sometimes they did not have the funds to hire a lobbyist and file as a lobbyist and do all the tracking that lobbying requires. And that is the need that IEC filled originally. Our work has definitely grown since then. We still serve that purpose. But lately we have found ourselves doing a lot of work, coalition building and organizing state-based efforts on different strategies and tactics, one of those being 30 by 30. So we're really excited to share how we plan on organizing Illinois specifically around some state-based goals.
Fabulous. Well, thank you to these three organizations for being here. I think it's the goal, there's so many levels of this, and having the perspective of three different organizations who operate in three different ways is very valuable. So I appreciate that you're here, and let's move on to the heart of this conversation, which is about 30 by 30. And so I guess my first question is, what is 30 by 30? And I would like to turn it over to Kate or Alayna to maybe tell us a little bit, just a broad overview about what the goal is.
I'm going to have Kate answer that. She has been working on that constantly all day and all night. Kate, did you want me to show the PowerPoint, or you just want to talk it out?
Yeah, that'd be great. Some pretty pictures.
Okay. Yeah, we have a pretty picture for you all.
That always helps.
There we go.
Awesome. Thank you, Alayna.
Mm-hmm.
So the 30 by 30 concept is basically a direct response to the rapid decline of biodiversity on our planet. The Living Planet Report, which was published in 2020, has revealed a global species loss of 68% in less than 50 years. And that's namely due to drivers like habitat fragmentation, climate change, pollution, invasive species, and overexploitation. And in addition, every 30 seconds or so in the US, we lose the equivalent of a football field in natural lands, and every hour, 40 acres of farmland is lost. And so this idea of conserving a specific percentage of land and water by a certain year in order to protect biodiversity and slow this loss actually gained traction earlier this century. Renowned biologist E.O. Wilson in 2016 called for half of Earth to be protected in order to manage sufficient enough habitat to reverse the species extinction crisis. And to oversimplify that, the aim was basically, if you save the habitat, you save the species, you save Earth. And so now the 30 by 30 initiative is said to be somewhat of an intermediate step on that ladder to protecting half of Earth or 50% by 2050. And currently reports have shown that roughly 26% of US waters and 12% of the lands are already protected. And so we are relatively on track, but there's still a ways to go on both, especially considering the fact that biodiversity is still being lost at an alarming rate. Also say that this concept is not limited to the United States. It's been adopted by over 80 world leaders, and it's a key agenda item on this year's UN Conference on Biodiversity, in addition to having been supported in an early Biden-Harris executive order. And so the why behind 30 by 30 is relatively undisputed. It's clear that we're losing species, land, and water at an alarming rate, and this loss has cascading effects on our communities. And this, as you know, looks like the loss of ecosystem services that many of our natural resources provide. So for example, we're losing pollinators that are essentially the little agricultural workers that help put food on the table. We are losing many wetland plant species that help provide storm buffers and filter toxins. We're losing parts of the Mississippi River, which serves as a cultural, transportational, subsistence, and spiritual hub. So the why is clear. What has been disputed, however, is the how. How do we protect 30% of land and water in the United States in just 9 years? And the jury is still out on that one. But what I can say is that the goal is guided by 5 key principles. 1, to support locally led conservation. 2, to work toward a more equitable and inclusive vision for nature conservation. 3, to honor the sovereignty of tribal nations. 4, to support private conservation. And 5, be guided by science. And these principles were developed namely to prevent repeating the history of land grabs and community extraction that were rooted, frankly, in racist and white supremacist intentions. And also these principles serve as somewhat of a North Star for nations and thus states to follow. And while these principles are relatively macro focused, still questions have been raised about the details. So what constitutes protection? What is going to, or who is going to be involved in deciding what's protected? What are the implications for communities that this will inevitably impact? And some states have actually started to begin to answer those questions through legislation. Hawaii, Nevada, California, Maine, South Carolina, New York have all introduced legislation outlining kind of their support for 30 by 30. And recently, Michigan actually introduced a bipartisan resolution outlining their support by 30 by 30 as well, which is exciting. So steps are being taken incrementally as states kind of work through the weeds of what this means for their land, water, and constituents. And so putting 30 by 30 into the context of the Mississippi River Network, we know that the Mississippi River is one of the largest economic drivers in our country and is home to a vast amount of diverse species. So for the states that kind of surround this beautiful flowing life force, 30 by 30 can help support state conservation goals, and the initiative can help ensure that vulnerable population and those living near major waterways will continue to have access to clean air, water, and outdoor spaces. So 30 by 30 has the potential to work. It has the potential to slow or even reverse the decline of biodiversity loss, increase outdoor access for underserved communities, hear and address the concerns of a variety of stakeholders, and ultimately ensure the longevity and long-term health of our planet. It will require a thoughtful approach, close monitoring and evaluation, and a commitment to holding environmental justice and social justice principles. And I'm excited to see what the organizations here today have to say about it. Thanks.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you, Kate. So that is a great overview, and I'm really looking forward to digging in. So my follow-up question that I will open up to all of our 5 panelists is, the goal is about land and ocean conservation. So what will it mean to clean waters and rivers in general? What's the connect there? And, you know, Kate started to speak to this a little bit. And then my additional question is, how do you see it impacting the Mississippi River in particular?
I could touch on that for just a second. Like, one of the things that we're doing really, at least on the Illinois front, is kind of what Kate was saying, like trying to figure out like, what does 30% exactly mean? Right now in Illinois, we are at about, I believe, 8% open lands status of our state land right now. And achieving 30, or is it 4%?
Yeah.
Like, see, I'm giving us too much credit. But the bottom line is that getting to 30% of, like, if you would think of like traditional open space protection, it's just not going to happen. So what we've been thinking through is, what does 30% mean? And over 70% of our state land is covered in agriculture right now. And I think that's a reality that we need to accept. That's something that we're not really going to be able to change numbers on. But what we can do is try to think through, how do you utilize those working lands in the state in order to help forward us towards some of these goals. Now, 30 by 30, I think, as a bigger, larger goal, is just doing things like carbon retention, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and all of those things that come with that. And I think that we're on the precipice of seeing farming practices change in the US in a lot of ways. And I think a big part of this work is going to be trying to figure out, how do we transition a lot of those acres for like corn and soy into more sustainable things that do things like promote cover crops, no-till, more crop diversity, like specialty crops, things that will help, stabilize soils and prevent nutrient pollution. I mean, I think one of the biggest goals of this thing is trying to get our state to have dedicated funding for nutrient loss reduction. Illinois continues every year to be one of the leading contributors of nitrogen and phosphorus into the Mississippi. And I think that we need to own up to that fact and start actually making some moves on this. Our state has traditionally not been great at funding natural solutions to these issues. Usually it's been focused on, water funds for water treatment for, water treatment facilities and that kind of thing, which is great. And they've made some good progress on that. But the bottom line is that the leading contributors of nitrogen and phosphorus continue to be ag, and we continue to be falling very far behind. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling now. I don't know where I was going with that. But the bottom line is that that's kind of the approach we're taking in Illinois on this. Like we need to kind of think outside the box, outside of just an open space perspective.
Right. And to Elliot's point, I think it's important that we recognize that water is flowing somewhere. So, while it is looking 30 by 30 is looking primarily at oceans and how we address that, the Mississippi River goes right into the Gulf, which then goes right into a bigger body of water. And I think states are realizing that, we can't get this work done just by depending on the federal government, because things move a little bit slower there. So by doing their part at the state level, we're all, contributing to saving as much land as we can to combat climate change.
So I'll chime in here as well, that I think nature is, as far as clean water is concerned, nature is the most effective water treatment plant. And I've always loved the idea, so I've got a duck stamp behind me. I've always loved the idea of wetlands as nature's kidneys. Like that has always resonated with me. And I think beyond that, wetlands, forests, grasslands, and sustainably operated working farmlands is, they help filter water and they provide clean water, and restoring these ecosystems and or protecting them from development is how we ensure we retain the natural infrastructure of the region. And I when we say protecting 30% of America's land and oceans by 2030, we, as Elliot alluded to, and we've talked about already, that we kind of think of it as a set, put a fence around it and leave it over there and don't touch it. That just doesn't account for the wide range of enduring solutions we can find for our land, and not just protecting the land, but how do we get 30% of America's land and waters to help protect the rest of the land and waters? How do we turn it around that it's not just have we hit 30% and then say like, okay, we've got enough? I mean, because we will hear throughout this effort, and we've already heard, it isn't, enough is enough. Like, how much do you really need protected? That land doesn't now we can't work that land. And I've always hated the idea of taking land out of production, because land is always producing something. And the goal that we should all strive to, especially in an ag heavy region, is how can we get land to produce as many things as possible? Can it produce food and crops and fiber and fuel at the same time as producing clean water and soil health and wildlife habitat and diversity. There's a lot of ways we can do it, but that only emphasizes more why we need to focus on private lands conservation. And when you ask, what does it mean for the Mississippi River? Public lands are awesome. I live in Virginia, and the only place you really go outside and like enjoy, nature is often on public land. So I get that they are super important. But as you all probably know, like if 30 by 30 becomes a public lands initiative, it's not going to help the Mississippi River very much. It's there are a lot of worthy efforts, especially out west, for public land conservation, and that will be a part of it, just like it already is. But if we're going to scale this up up and down the Mississippi, and really anywhere east of the Continental Divide, it's going to have to be on private lands, or that's going to have to be a big part of it. So the way to do that is scaling up conservation through voluntary incentive-based conservation, getting farmers on board and landowners and ranchers and forest owners to then look next door at their neighbor and say, like, how do I get to where you are? Like, how did you get these kind of contracts or grants or loans to do work on your farm that then makes it more profitable? I mean, precision conservation is another huge part, a thing that's going to be a part of this. When you show a landowner, I know I'm on a soapbox a little bit here, but when you show a landowner like what the red spots on their land are and what the green spots are, and say, 30 years ago, even 15 years ago, they would just know that this is their profit on their farm. But if you show them they're losing money over here, and that can be better off producing something other than maybe that crop, or maybe a different kind of crop, or some kind of, buffer or something like that, it makes a huge difference. So how does conservation pay for itself? And I think not always the case, but it is often the case.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, while I have you speaking, I'm curious, one, how do the existing Farm Bill conservation programs play into this? And then also for the IEC team who work with farmers and ranchers and landowners very often, what has the reception been from those folks for this goal?
Yeah, so that's a question I can probably answer either in 10 seconds or about 3 hours. And I'm going to try to hit the in between if I can. But, so NRCS and the Farm Bill has a number of programs that all kind of, there's a range of lengths for each one. There's permanent easements, and that's what the Conservation Fund works a lot on, and permanent both working lands and then wetland easements and forest easements in the Farm Bill. And there are also cost share and more management focused programs. And I think one thing we're going to struggle with kind of as a conservation and environmental community going forward is what protection really means. And we kind of already touched on this a little bit, is that, some of you may be familiar with the Conservation Reserve Program. Does a 10 or 15 year contract to set aside this land from crop production, year 11 and year 16 is sooner than you think, does that count? Or does it need to be permanent? And I think there's room to kind of find all of these things under this umbrella. And there's a lot of room for, when you come out of something like CRP or come out of a short-term contract or incentive payment from NRCS or a Farm Bill program, how can we incentivize you doing that going forward? How can that be seed money instead of just the only incentive that's the reason you're doing it? So there's a whole host of Farm Bill programs that can help landowners, do this kind of thing on their land. And I think they should be counted towards this goal, because the idea is the more the merrier. I mean, we're not going to stop at 30%. I mean, if we get to 30%, which is, this is all kind of this aspirational goal, we're not kind of, just ticking on a spreadsheet like acre after acre. And then, theoretically, if we get there, we're not going to say like, all right, we're good here. Like I said, the idea is that how can as much land as possible work to produce as many benefits for society. So, when I can't remember who said, I think Kate, you might have said, every hour, the 40 acres loss of farmland. How do we protect that from being, I like that I live really close to a Target and a Walmart, but how do we protect that from becoming another one, right? How do we protect that land so that way it can be sustainably operated going forward? Because it can only get less productive for those ecological and environmental benefits, and we want to protect against that.
And I think the second half of your question, you were asking how farmers were receiving some of this information. And here in Illinois, I'll talk about some of our good friends and MRN partners, the Stewardship Alliance. They do a lot of our on the ground work with farmers and organizing around policy, really grassroots led by farmers. So here in Illinois, we have a good feel for how it's being received because we have this really cool coalition of farmers that want to talk about policy and contribute to policy and tell us where those barriers are and what we can do about them, coming from the people who are up against the barriers. So it's a really helpful group they're called the Soil Health Caucus farmers that the Stewardship Alliance organizes. And those folks have identified, thankfully, some of the same things that we have identified. They think that there needs to be funding for the nutrient loss reduction strategy. They think there needs to be education around all of these puzzle pieces of incentives and programs and rules. And their solution for that is the soil water conservation districts here in Illinois are horrifically underfunded. In our Illinois budget impasse, they lost 60 to 75% of staff. They were cut down a lot of, each county used to have an individual office. They were all combined. Some counties are doing 4 or 5 counties. So that was a big solution that came out of the Soil Health Caucus farmers was we need to get the soil water conservation districts back up and running. There are boots on the ground. There are education piece. They help us bridge the gap between being farmers and understanding federal programs, state programs, all of these pieces. So they identified soil water conservation districts, funding for the nutrient loss reduction strategy, and then funding for state incentive programs like the cover crop program here in Illinois. Illinois and Iowa have a really neat cover crop program that incentivizes farmers to plant cover crops by offering them a crop insurance discount for each acre. So it's a $5 an acre discount. Super neat program. The statistics that came out the first year were that it was a really high, Elliot will know the number. I always say too high, but it was like half of the farmers that were enrolling in this program, it was the first time they had planted cover crops. So it was really telling us that funding this program is helping people start. 70%. Okay, good. I was afraid I was gonna over exaggerate, but it really means that these programs are initiating cover crop use, not just paying people for something that they're already doing, which we do want to incentivize those guys too, but it's really great to see the impact of new farmers using a program like that.
I would add too that one of the things that we're seeing in terms of like farmers being receptive to like these ideas, like we haven't messaged directly really on 30 by 30 yet, but we are definitely seeing a shift in attitudes towards climate change in general among farmers. I think a lot of that unfortunately has to do with extreme weather events over the last, really just the last few years, between the major storms in Iowa and Northern Illinois that wiped out, a lot of crops and infrastructure kind of things, and then major flooding in the Midwest, which continues to be an issue every spring. I think is really, it was a rude wake up call for a lot of folks. And I'd say the one benefit of it is that, I think the Earth's climate is on their minds now because it's affecting their bottom line in the end, which it's unfortunate it has to come to that, but, that's the reality we're living in right now. So I'm at least glad that, people are starting to wake up a bit.
Yeah, and just as us building power towards one goal, we're seeing a lot of organizations that wouldn't traditionally say the word climate change or the phrase climate change starting to put that in their policies. Like we're seeing it in Illinois state publications. We're seeing it in the farm bureaus. So we're really seeing a lot more buy-in from farmers and organizations, not buy-in, acknowledgement that that climate change is happening and we need to work on it together. I would say the other message that resonates with farmers that we hear from farmers all the time is, I want to leave this land better for the generations coming after me. I want to pass this land along to my sons and daughters and grandchildren, and be able to not have them think that we depleted it and ruined it. So I think speaking locally to farmers, like, you're contributing to this huge goal, you're contributing to reducing climate change, but you're also helping your bottom dollar in your own backyard and making sure that your future and your family are sustainable as well, is a message that resonates.
Excellent. I might kick it back to Kate and Alayna. What are you hearing from state legislators about the goal, and how do you see states, collaborating on this goal? Is there regional collaboration, or what does it look like at the state by state level?
I can jump in. I think the vibe I've gotten is that it's really early. And so most of the conversations have been around, first of all, do we support this as a state legislator? What could this mean? And what could it mean if I do or do not support it? For the states that have introduced legislation, most of those have been resolutions in support. I will note that Hawaii's resolution and kind of work looks like somewhat of a management plan, and they have been really creative in the way they've approached it, in the sense that they have developed this kind of four-pronged plan to center nature-based solutions, community collaboration, monitoring and evaluation, and some of the more Hawaii-specific cultural and spiritual practices that inform some of their conservation work. And so that has been kind of the only example of more specific 30 by 30 work in the states, other than kind of not run-of-the-mill, but other like ancillary land and water conservation policies that don't necessarily fit into the 30 by 30 narrative. That's kind of the arena that I'm seeing right now. I'll also just flag that when we have been talking to state legislators, many of them have voiced the concern that, like, well, what about the other 70%, right? Like, how do we, I think it might have been Elliot or Andrew that mentioned earlier, how do we prioritize protecting 30% of land that is going to be substantial enough to support the other land and water that isn't going to have a protected status, whatever that does mean. And so that's just a piece that I'll add in some of the states thinking around this, is that it's not just limited to that 30%. They are thinking about the entirety of the United States land and water resources. Alayna, did you have anything to add?
No, I think you did really well with that. Yeah, well said.
Well, speaking of states, I would love to hear, I know it's early and things are getting started, but from the IEC team, what is the process like to create this vision for the 30 by 30 plan for Illinois? So I heard you're working with ISA. Just would love to hear more about how you're engaging folks and what you think the ultimate Illinois plan might look like.
Yeah. Oh, I think my internet connection's gone.
We can hear you still, if that helps.
Okay, I will talk. I've got you guys frozen, but I will talk. And if I cut out, Elliot, you just pick up where I leave off.
Okay.
Yeah. So we are working at a really grassroots, building things from the bottom up process. We want Illinois to contribute to this 30%. But like Elliot mentioned earlier, we're really at about 4% of land that's set aside. And Illinois, heavy agriculture state, we've talked a lot about this already. We're not like a Western state that's going to say, hey, we're going to expand these 5 state parks and check mark, we are at the 30%. So we have to be really creative and really think through, how do we contribute to this goal? How do we make 30% of our land and water contribute to the goal without maybe being put into public lands? Because that's just not really an option here. We need that land as working land. So we've thought through, we have a really broad coalition right now. We are just kind of scooping up everyone who might be a stakeholder, who might be interested in contributing to this. And we are listening. We are going into communities, listening to ideas. We've come up with 4, we call them buckets of work. We're really modeling after the climate table. Here in Illinois, we did an Illinois climate table that really worked to pass the Clean Energy Jobs Act, still working. And they had a really great model where they brought a lot of folks to the table, community-based, and they have done some things really well, and they have really learned through the process, and we get to benefit from the mistakes that they've made and the work that they've done, and try to do this modeled after them, but getting to learn from them too. So all that background is just to say that right now we have a coalition. We have a lot of folks that are interested. We have a lot of voices at the table, and we are moderating some conversations, and we are listening and listening and listening. We are going into communities and listening. We're listening to experts about soil health. We're listening to the folks that live in Chicago and the folks that live in Southern Illinois. We've thought through the buckets of work that this is going to fall into in Illinois. And the climate table calls these pillars because they've been finalized and agreed on. We're not calling them pillars yet because right now we're not sure if these are the 4 places that we're going to focus. But our 4 buckets are traditional, like public land conservation. Even I think we're even going to include private land trust conservation in that bucket, land conservation. Then we have sustainable agriculture practices and all the things that fall into, frankly, corn and soybean, what we can do on those acres that are normally planted in corn and soybean. What sort of practices can we use to protect that soil and make those acres contribute to our goal? Then we have a bucket that is the local food piece. So it's local food infrastructure systems at each scale. So from farmers markets all the way up to, you know, in the state of Illinois, maybe our goal is to increase us from, we eat about 4% of the food grown here in Illinois. So maybe one of our goals in that pillar, that bucket, is to increase that to 10 or 15. And then the last pillar is a resilient economy and green jobs. So we want to protect that piece of making sure that folks can access green jobs, access traditional conservation jobs that they may not have had access to in the past. And we just want to include the jobs and the economy piece as a bucket of our work. What am I forgetting, Elliot?
No, I think you covered it. Like, we're really on like the ground floor of this thing. We've got about 60 different organizations that have signed up and are working with us here in Illinois, from big ones like the Sierra Club all the way down to smaller community-based organizations in the Chicago and Metro East area outside of St. Louis. And yeah, we're right at the precipice of this whole thing.
So one thing to mention is our ultimate outcome, our big giant goal, is that in Illinois, the conservation community, conservation farm, local food, jobs community is all speaking with one voice and aiming at several or a set of goals all together. I think this organizing came from, you know, we were hearing about 30 by 30, talking about it. The Biden executive order came out. We knew that the Shed Aquarium was doing some great work. We knew that the Shawnee was doing some great work. We wanted to think through, how do we keep from stepping on each other's toes and us starting a big project here and us starting a big project here and the funding kind of being spread out too thin? How do we actually do a coordinated state-based effort? And so that is where our coalition goal came from, is let's all speak with a powerful voice. And then I think one of the ultimate outcomes for us as the policy buffs and the ones saying, you know what would make some big changes, some actual policy changes, is in 2022, we'd like to introduce a policy package that includes solutions under each of those pillars. So that may include some things that we expect it to include are funding the Illinois Nutrient Loss Protection Strategy, or the Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, funding soil and water conservation districts, funding some programs like the cover crop program, expanding local food infrastructure funding, and then just a lot, supporting land trusts, a lot of solutions that are hopefully going to come from our community, all buttoned up into a legislative package similar to the Clean Energy Jobs Act, like a big heavy one, that will be supported by our entire community because it was built by them. So that sounds super aspirational, but we've done it before with the Clean Energy Jobs Act, and we're really looking forward to figuring out what those solutions are and how we establish those goals and which strategies fall under them and which ones are policy pieces that we can work.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I know we are in our last 9 minutes, so I'm going to ask my panelists to think about 2 questions right now. One is for individuals and organizations who want to get involved. How do we do that? And 2, if there's anything else on your mind that you want to share as your final thought, think about that. So stew on that for a second, and then for my participants, if you have any questions now, I know there are a couple of questions in the chat already. Please pop your question into the chat box as we hear this lightning round from the panelists. So how do we get involved, and any final thoughts that any of the 5 of you have? Lindsay, I see you're unmuted if you are ready to go first.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about how to get involved in Illinois. If any of you, I know that we have a lot of folks here, but to get involved in our effort, just get a hold of Elliot or I, and we are holding these phone calls every 2 weeks to just listen. If you're a community group, we have, hopefully we might have a little bit of funding to organize listening sessions. Different groups can kind of organize them for their own folks. And think through what those solutions and strategies are. As an individual, you can get involved with IEC with the state-based effort and the federal-based effort if we have a strategy there, whatever that becomes, by just following us on social media, sharing our action alerts. Lots of times we'll have pre-written or scripted or talking points that you can talk to your legislator about. We'll have lobby days that will really walk you through the process of advocating for your priorities and our shared priorities.
So I will defer to some of the state folks that work specifically on state issues for kind of the first part of that question, though I will note from a federal standpoint and a farm bill standpoint that for many of these programs, match and leverage of non-federal dollars is a huge need. So for instance, the ag land easements within the Ag Conservation Easement Program and the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, those programs need a lot of both state and private dollars to make them work. So a lot of times that comes from state funds that are funded by the state, that are funded by legislatures or other mechanics in states. So so be sure to kind of be thinking about that. I'll also note, how we, as far as individuals and our organizations, how we talk about this, and I know we all know this, but like it matters a lot because, we know that words carry meaning, but words also, just 30 by 30, and we talk about protecting land. It's what we want to do, but how that's received by certain folks, they're looking for a reason maybe to oppose it, and we need to avoid as much as we can giving them a reason. So one thing that came to mind on that note was last month during Tom Vilsack's confirmation hearing to be USDA Secretary, Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa referred to 30 by 30 in the executive order from President Biden. And she said, quote, "I know that it's very concerning for our farmers to have a proposal that would limit the opportunity for them to farm with widespread retirement of farmland." So that's not what 30 by 30, hopefully we've made clear that that's not what 30 by 30 is, that we need a wide range of enduring solutions, sustainable land traditional uses, and working farmlands. And so there is a question to me earlier that I just saw now, that conservation fund work on working ag lands, and yes, because we need them to be a part of this solution. So Lindsay mentioned corn and soy, and we talked a little bit about like the different types of uses of ag. Just last week, my wife and I, who have our second baby boy coming in April, we bought a minivan. And I tried as long as I could, but we had to buy a minivan. but they're hybrid now. So my minivan, which maybe let's take corn and soybean, is not the best thing for the environment as far as like gas, consumption, fuel consumption, gets 36 miles to the gallon. That's a lot better than most minivans. It's not a Prius, it's not an electric car, but it's a lot better than most minivans, and I need the minivan. So we need corn and soy to a certain extent, and we need to make use of that land in a productive and sustainable way, but we can't get rid of it. So how do we make, again, I'm going back to the same kind of song, but we need to include all of these things in our solutions.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew, I just thank you all for all of the comments today. It's really interesting to hear these perspectives that I haven't really considered with working with state legislators, but I'll just say that I am approaching this with urgent patience, in the sense that, like, yes, we have 9 years until the 2030 goal, but like Earth is going to be around longer than that, hopefully. And so something that I've been talking about with state legislators is that this is a long-term plan. And so doing our due diligence in consulting with homeowners and agricultural workers and outdoor and hunting and angling communities and implementing social science to collect those perceptions, really consulting and collaborating with tribal nations who have released their own set of priorities about 30 by 30 is going to be a way that this is done thoughtfully and captures the nuances of all the 30 by 30 entails. Because Andrew, you're right, this is not a land grab, this is not a way to reverse agriculture. Hopefully it works in concert with that. And so thinking about how you can get involved, something that I've been doing on a personal level is just trying to read every perspective, even the ones that I disagree with, because it's so nuanced. There's going to be chatter from all sorts of different angles, and it's going to be important that those are considered, because we've done land grabs wrong in the past, and this is a chance to do something better with this, to approach it with justice and equity and true inclusion of the people that are going to be the most impacted by this initiative.
Right. And to Andrew and Lindsay's point, the goal is not to put a gate around the land. The goal is to be more sustainable with it. So what we're doing with MRLC is we're, making sure legislators are looking at policies that address sustainable agriculture or soil health. It's looking at ways to reduce essentially, how we have been treating the Mississippi River and to make it a better place. So just keeping that in mind. And I would encourage you all to reach out to your legislators and let them know that you are aware of 30 by 30 and you're curious about it and you want to see what their take is on it. And you want more information and to see where they are.
Great. Thank you all. So Mary Ellen, I see you had a few questions. I think you are the sole question asker. If there are any remaining questions that you had, I'm happy for you to just ask them and unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Sure, appreciate it. I guess one of the questions, more detail, you can send an email about how the reduced premium works for cover crops. So we don't need to answer that now, but
okay.
I'm a county soil and water district commissioner, so I'm interested in knowing how that works because we're struggling in South Central Iowa to convince farmers to use cover crops, and there are a lot of issues behind that. One of the bigger questions is I'm part of the Upper Mississippi River Region ILO with the League of Women Voters. I see a couple of other league members on here. Is this 30 by 30 primarily an Illinois project?
No, I mean, I would say, I mean, this really was born out of like an international movement initially. I think that some of the initial ideas out of this really came from some things that were going on with the United Nations, looking at some of the goals that were set up under the Paris Climate Accord. This was, I think, a lot of the times when people think about that coalition of people, a lot of it is focused on the energy and transportation side of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, which is obviously a huge problem. But there were some folks that wanted to say like, hey, like as Andrew was saying, like the earth is like the best filter for a lot of this stuff. So reducing emissions is a really good thing, but we also need to be utilizing like the natural infrastructure that's already in place and expanding that. So in short, no, Illinois is going to be a tiny piece of a much larger, puzzle that we're all going to work together to try to solve.
So are you working with the Iowa Environmental Council?
We personally have worked with them before and talked with them a little bit, but right now, I mean, this Illinois effort, it's all Illinois either based organizations or larger national organizations that have a presence in Illinois.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, I know we are 1 minute over time, but I am so appreciative to everyone for joining us. And thank you again to our 5 outstanding speakers, Kate, Alayna, Elliot, Lindsay, and Andrew. We thank you. We will circulate the link to the YouTube recording. And in the meantime, feel free to find the One Mississippi YouTube channel and subscribe to it so you can be the first to know when we post videos and other great content. But that will conclude our event today. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time. Take care and have a terrific Tuesday. Bye, everybody.